Okay, great. We're recording. All right. So welcome everybody to our reading group on Beyond the Pleasure Principle. This is our first session. We're very excited. We have a nice quorum of people from around the world, people from Australia to Europe to the States and beyond. Here's the agenda for today. So I'm going to do most of the sort of talking, but again, my preference is for folks to intervene at any point as I am sort of summarizing the text. And really what I'm going to do at point number 2, after I say just a few brief things about the text, is really just go through line by line. I've just highlighted key things and I want to do a close reading. And then once we're done with section 2, as you know, it ends with the Fort Da game of Freud's grandson. And so this actually becomes a kind of neglected philosophical origin point to the repetition compulsion. And I say neglected because there's many other sort of primary scenes of philosophical imports from Freud's discourse, and obviously from Lacan's. Lacan had a lot to say on the Fort Da, because in a certain sense, it became of profound interest once Lacan develops the objet A. So I want to get into that. I also, unfortunately, have been doing some reading from philosophers on the Fort Da, including Derrida. And so I have some things to say about what he has to say about this game as well. I don't know if you're aware that he commented on it. And actually for Derrida, it's like an extremely significant thing as it pertains to psychoanalysis writ large. And then I want to end by graphing a little bit of Lacan's own reading of the game. And then we'll just go through the questions. We have about over 20 questions. I thought it might be nice to do the questions at the end. So I've listed everyone. Everyone sent emails, not everyone, but many sent email questions. And thank you for doing so. Other people sent more like notes. The vision, or the idea there is we want to create an archive when all is said and done for the benefit of other readers of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So your notes, your questions, your interrogations, your reflections, etc., we'll put into some kind of compendium. Maybe we'll create a website for them. And really also, obviously, like these are meant for group discussion. So if you raise a highly speculative question about, I don't know, set theory, maybe I can answer it, maybe I can't. So I will ask others to lend their expertise when appropriate. So is everybody good on that agenda? Nice. Okay, very good, very good. So yeah, my name is Daniel. I think many of you probably met me from like Twitter, perhaps, or something like that, but it's really an honor to be with you all. I'm having green tea and it's very delicious. Getting over a cold, but it's like the last day of the cold. So it's kind of that liberating feeling where you're sort of like, I'm free until my children give me another one, which is like in the next couple of days. Okay, so here we are. So I'm literally, okay, the text that I wanted us to focus on was a recently translated text by a couple of Lacanian philosophers who I like quite a lot. And I recommended you buy it. It's $10 for the Adobe digital version. However, I really dislike the Adobe digital thing because it's not flexible with like us hackers. You know what I mean? It's not easy to use. And it's really hard to like copy paste to like, it's not a PDF that I'm used to. So I am, even though Ernest Jones, the translator, actually hated this book, I think we should rely on his translation. That's my thought. And that's what I'm copying here. And that's what I'm sort of using as our sort of measure in this presentation. So is that okay? I mean, I hope that's okay. I mean, you can obviously still read the other one, but I mean, I'm not really of the mind that, you know, the choice of certain German words hold that much significance as it pertains to our interpretation of the text, that I'm willing to claim that Jones's translation is somehow inadequate or seriously flawed. I'm not convinced that it is. But if anyone disagrees with that, we can, there can be a mutiny on that particular point, if you wish. Okay, no mutiny, unfortunately, although I'm definitely not a captain. I'm reading Moby Dick this summer. My God, whew, what a fucking nightmare. I didn't realize that like this Ahab figure was like worse than Donald Trump himself, really. Okay. What else? Other housekeeping things am I neglecting to mention? Oh yes, we have a special guest. So the big trajectory here is we're going to have 3 sessions on the text itself. It's a short book, really. We're going to read things line by line on our own. I mean, not in here. We're going to kind of look at passages and do a lot of extra sort of secondary reading, which I put in a Dropbox link. But when we're done with those first 3 sessions, a wonderful comrade and psychoanalyst from Brazil named Gabriel Tupanambas, who has a sort of incredible book coming out on Lacanian psychoanalysis, he's going to give 2 talks, largely on the theme of drive and the transference, which I think will really help us ground a much more competent perspective on what Freud is up to in the book. A lot of people have asked about this business, which you see early on in the text, of sort of World War I and the traumatic war neuroses. Actually, we can talk about that tonight, and we will, but Tupanamba has actually, like, his first presentation is going to be about that. So more on that later, which I think is very exciting. It's not only about that, but it's kind of linked to that. Okay, that covers housekeeping. So the text opens, and might want to say just a couple of things about its sort of placement in Freud's work before we truly dive in. I mean, there's so much to say that much of the background will come as we proceed into the text. I think, you know, many of the Freudian disciples were very polarized by the publication of the book. It's obviously an account of a speculative and philosophical level. Philosophers, psychoanalysts, and others have actually debated this precise point about its scientific efficacy, which we're going to get into later. For example, Ernest Jones makes the argument that Freud's theory of the death drive is his sort of vulgar attempt to insert what he calls the father image into the origin story of his wider system, right? So there is definitely a tendency to look at the production of this text as a sort of radically biographical gesture. And we'll see that as we get to the end of section 2, where of the 3 examples of repetition compulsion, war neuroses, dreams, and the games of children, Freud uses the games of children from the example of his own family. I mean, it's of significant interest. More generally, a lot of the ideas that we have developed here prior to death drive, which we're not even going to talk about tonight, that's for session 2. And session 2 next week will probably be our kind of meatiest philosophical, speculative. Tonight will be as well. but our next meeting where we look at sections, I think 3 through 6, is when we get into the heart of the contribution of the book. So I won't get too much into the genealogy of various concepts that are developed, because I think we can kind of retroactively pick those apart. Although I will say one of our members in this group sent a wonderful kind of essay to us, which I can share with everyone, about precisely that point, right? Which is sort of what were the preconcepts that Freud developed prior to Beyond the Pleasure Principle that kind of sort of animated their development. Because if we see Beyond the Pleasure Principle as the kind of refinement of his statement of psychoanalysis as such, I think it is important for us to sort of at least get a grasp on some of the key points from which he was launching, and then refine them in this text. So he begins. I'm going to see if there's anything else I wish to say about the text in general, and other people can jump in if they have other thoughts on, the context in which Beyond the Pleasure Principle was written. I would be more than happy. As I pull up my notes. Okay. So one big thing I wish to say at the outset here, in addition to what I've already said, is that a lot of psychoanalysts were thinking that the kind of origin of Freud's theory of mental life writ large is located within his theory of narcissism. And Freud was interested, and therefore as a theory of the ego. And Freud was interested, as you'll see in this text, to enter into a much broader sort of rooting of his methodology beyond simply a theory of a narcissism and of the ego. And so the pleasure principle, as Deleuze will famously say later, is actually never fully defined as a scientific. It remains a kind of quasi principle, a transcendental kind of Kantian regulative idea, according to Deleuze, which actually is its strength. The fact that it is a regulative idea is precisely its elusive, abyssal, non-foundational strength as a concept. So for philosophers, what this text is a great victory for them, for their possibility of having dialogue with psychoanalysis, right? And somebody asked a beautiful question, which is, what did the ego psychoanalysis community think of this text? Were they pro or were they against it? And I would actually say in many senses they were against it, right? In part because, as we'll see, Freud is making a separation from the centrality of the ego in his theory by emphasizing a completely different origin point to consciousness and to life. Then again, why would a psychoanalyst want to say, from the perspective of psychoanalysis, what consciousness is? This is, why did he think this is necessary, right? Why did he think it's necessary to locate the origin of life in relationship to consciousness, right? These are the nonetheless, the kind of questions that animate the text. And there are certain secondary commentators, many of whom are philosophers, that I think have done, and I think Lacan does the best job, that have actually driven the insights that are developed in this text farther, much farther than Freud himself. Therefore, I even think it's fair to say that we think the periodization of Freud's ideas onto his own scholarly production, right? His own thought production. But in reality, Lacan was starting his investigations after the publication of this text, you see. So Lacan took the truths that were developed here, the highly speculative truths, and I believe he formalized them farther than anyone else. So that's actually why I'm very happy that in each of our sessions, we'll be reading Lacan super close, because I believe that he remains the best reader of Freud, pure and simple. Anyways, there's more to be said here, but I think I'll jump into the text. Are there any questions about anything that has been said thus far?
I had a quick question about the use of regulative idea. It's a little slight technical question, because sometimes I get the sense with regulative idea that it's like an idea that never actualizes, but just is like something that's in the distance. Is that the same way it's used with Deleuze's interpretation of death drive, or is that not applicable?
Yeah. Well, I think the big point that Deleuze will pick up upon is that Freud's theory of repetition that he develops here is hinged upon a notion of death drive, which is non-foundational, which is precisely abyssal. And it is that abyssal status, which he then names, or which he then puts onto a Kantian framework, right? As a kind of unknowable point, an unknowable point of origin, let's say. So I was going to actually dedicate a whole section of this reading series on Deleuze's reading of Freud. But anyways, the person that I wanted to speak about that wasn't available, and I sort of decided against it in a certain way. All of this is gathered in Difference in Repetition by Deleuze. Obviously, though, Freud is a huge influence on Deleuze throughout his career, though. But I would say that is the answer right there. That Deleuze basically makes a claim that Freud's theory of death drive is this kind of unaccounted for, not scientific origin point of the very logic of his system, right? But instead of saying that this is a failure and it should be rejected and so on, he says this is actually the strength of it, right? From a Kantian kind of standpoint, is how I would characterize that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so let's hop in. Now, again, as we go through this, I encourage you to bring the text up on like another screen, or sort of, if you have it printed out, or if you have a physical copy, sort of read along. So obviously Freud begins the text with a kind of general notion that, pleasure is generally thought of in relationship to pain as a kind of economic relationship. He says, we have decided to consider pleasure and pain in relation to the quantity of excitation present in the psychic life, and not confined in any way along such lines that pain corresponds with an increase in pleasure with a decrease in this quantity. We do not thereby commit ourselves to a simple relationship between the strength of the feelings and the changes corresponding with them, least of all judging from psychophysiological experiences. So the main point here is that we kind of think of it purely as a kind of biological substrate of excitations measured over a given period of time. And he then points out that several thinkers of the time, including Fechner, thought that the kind of balance of this economic relation was one that the mental life was aiming towards a kind of stability. So stability, instability as the kind of wider logic by which pleasure operates within the body and the mental life, right? But Freud rejects this view, as you can see here. He says, if such a thing existed, then the vast majority of our psychic processes would necessarily be accompanied by pleasure or would conduce to it, while the most ordinary experience emphatically contradicts that conclusion. One can only say that a strong tendency towards the pleasure principle exists in the psyche, to which, however, certain other forces or conditions are opposed. So that the ultimate issue cannot always be in accordance with the pleasure tendency. So I think that's very clear enough. It would be a kind of naivete to think that purely on its own terms, the economic theory doesn't hold. He then introduces on about page 3 of the text the notion of the reality principle, and he defines the reality principle in essence as a type of delayed gratification. He doesn't really go into examples of that, but I think it's obviously quite intuitive to develop some examples. He says, quote, under the influence of the instinct of the ego for self-preservation, it is replaced by the reality principle, which, without giving up the intention of ultimately attaining pleasure, yet demands and enforces the postponement of satisfaction, the renunciation of manifold possibilities of it, and the temporary endurance of pain on the long and circuitous road to pleasure. So it's related to reality principle, but it's not necessarily in a dialectic with the reality principle, and nor is the pleasure principle necessarily in a dialectic with pleasure pain. So he's sort of bringing these up and then letting them go. Then thirdly, he goes on to say that it is has its a kind of origin point in sex impulses. And they happen over and over again, that whether acting through these impulses or operating in the ego itself, the sex impulses tend to prevail over the reality principle. Okay, so far so good. He then shifts gears and really makes a pivot, which I think is super significant for our understanding of later concepts that he's giving us. And that is that there is this relationship between internal and external, and the notion that pleasure can only be symbolized. That is, it's much more significant for us to think about the definition of the pleasure principle from the standpoint of perception, representation, and of the perceptual order. And he says, quote, most of the pain we experience is of a perceptual order, perception either of the urge of unsatisfied instincts or of something in the external world, which may be painful in itself or may arouse painful anticipations in the psychic apparatus. The reaction to these claims of impulse and the threats of danger, in which the real activity of the psychic apparatus is manifested, may be guided correctly by the pleasure principle or by the reality principle, which modifies this. It seems thus necessary to recognize a still more far-reaching limitation of the pleasure principle. Okay, and I've noted here it's important we understand perceptions of pain and external danger in order to grasp the structure of it. So that's the end of section 1. He's sort of laying down some just very general points about how these things have been thought, and what one gathers is that the scientific community from psychology, but also from biology, has a kind of under-theorization of this, right? So I really found the first section a bit scant and a bit, like really the whole thing reads as a kind of essay whereby Freud's not really being that generous in terms of telling us his thesis out front. So it's sort of written in that classic mode where the thesis is developed as he sort of, it's almost in that sense like a meditation that links from one meditation to the other, with no necessary relationship from a beginning point where he's sort of spilling the beans of what my argument is. I feel like today we're forced to write that way, and we sort of don't have people that write in this manner, not near as much. I don't know if anyone would actually perceive this form of writing to be generous or good. I wonder what you think about that. Anyways, so section 2 is obviously much more meaty, and he immediately enters into this notion of traumatic neuroses, And this is where this sort of famous passage comes about. He had written about this before, okay? And in essence, obviously everyone I think knows that Freud treated many of the veterans of the First World War and gained a sort of certain amount of sort of profound insight, especially in relationship to what he had gained from the hysteric subjects that first initiated the psychoanalytic method, and that is what we see here. So we can just sort of read through this. After a severe shock of a mechanical nature. Sorry, did somebody want to say something?
Yes, sorry. Before jumping into section 2, I just had some thoughts on section 1 as well that I wanted to see if it spurred anyone.
Introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Bradshaw. Yep. But I wanted to ask about this metapsychology term that comes up because Strachey tells you that this is the inauguration of like the last phase. And Freud on the first page sort of suggests that this is what we now distinguish as the term metapsychological. There's something of a conflict there maybe in a way, or a tendency to view Freud as more complete on Strachey's part than he really is. But the question is, what is metapsychology? And Freud tells you that it's a combination. He says it's the combination of topographical and dynamic systems. But finally, what he'll be giving us now is an economic model. And the economic model is important, but it's also rather peculiar or queer. But before jumping to the economic ones, I won't give you that intellectual genealogy of these things, but in the papers on technique, in remembering repetition and working through, Freud talks about these two topographical and dynamic systems or dynamic modes of working. He says that descriptively speaking, and this is how psychoanalysis would appear to most people, a psychoanalyst aims to fill in gaps in memory. But dynamically speaking, he says, and this is what's important for a psychoanalyst from the inside of psychoanalysis, the goal is different. The goal is to overcome resistances due to repression. That's Freud's answer. And so now we have something else. There's an economy which is at work. And one of the quotes that we read just a moment ago, it goes on. Freud says that pleasure and unpleasure are not just a ratio or a simple relation of excitation, but something to do. He says the factor that determines the feeling of pleasure is probably the amount of increase or diminution in the quantity of excitation in a given period of time. I think this is a really crucial point and one which almost no one picks up, except Deleuze, perhaps, because this is the concept of differentiation from calculus, to take a difference with respect to time, to understand difference with respect to time. This is what the libido is really about, and this is the sense in which it's a transcendental or regulative concept. It's an economy not of things or objects, but of speeds. And this is something which Freud does definitely remain very tentative about. He laments that scientists, philosophers aren't able to give us any clues about it. But nevertheless, he wants to push forward. And I think that this question of the differentiation is really of the essence in a way, because what Freud is getting at here on page 11 of the standard edition, sorry, page 9, he says that this pleasure principle follows from the principle of constancy. And that's the question that he's getting at in this paragraph is, if life is economic, why isn't it the case? I mean, the simplest economy is to run to zero. Why isn't everything simply dead? Why is it the case that life achieves a certain constancy, a homeostasis, an internal environment, which can wreak havoc on the subject, even as it's subject to an external environment? And how are these two things related in a way? This is what the pleasure principle and its deviation through the reality principle get at. This principle of constancy. It's a question of, are there actually existing infinities in the finite world, in a strange way? And this question of an actually existing infinity has to do with this organic homeostasis or constancy that Freud is puzzling over. How does an organism achieve it? What does it bring to its mental functioning, or how does this mental functioning reflux back onto its organic stability? Anyway, thank you. Sorry.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah, no, other thoughts are welcome. Other interventions are very much welcome there. I mean, I think, please.
Hi. This sort of reminds me of what Zizek says. He pointed out a couple times about the problem of life isn't like, how does it...
Sorry, who's talking? Sorry, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Sorry, what did you say?
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Jonas.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. So he says, yeah, the problem of life isn't how an organism relates to its environment, but how it draws the line of itself. I guess the barrier of life, I guess. I guess that was one of my questions, is I'm not really sure what the difference between homeostasis is and the, like, maintaining a barrier and creating and having a definite barrier. But that does seem to be the problem here, the constancy of a barrier.
Yeah.
Aaron, the issue of the barrier will come up in later sections. This is what defines the organism initially, and this is a big part of Brassier's reading, which I'm not terribly familiar with, but Zupančič talks about it a bit in her section on the drive and what is sex. As regards to the first point, I mean the earlier point made about differential rhythms at play, I can't say that this is a really long-standing theme in Freud, or at least the only other instance of this coming to mind, this idea of almost a kind of tempo to psychic life, is you find traces of this in the early letters to Fleece, you know, in the pre-psychoanalytic writings. He talks about, you know, the kind of rhythms of analysis, the architecture of the symptom. Jameson Webster covers this really beautifully in her Conversion Disorder, but I can't speak much more to it than that, other than it's a very neglected topic in Freud. And if you're looking for, you know, the kind of initial traces of it, you do find it in these, again, like the letters to Fleece, and I'm not sure if it really surfaces in the Project for Scientific Psychology, but that's of course the other kind of gray eminence, as it were, for beyond the pleasure principle. You find a lot of, you know, early articulations of these things, and not to mention alongside the metapsychological supplement to the interpretation of dreams, a lot of the most kind of rigorous formulations of Freud's metapsychology, particularly as it pertains to the pleasure principle, reality principle, as these are conjugated along the kind of divide between primary process and secondary process.
Wonderful. And Aaron, just want to give a plug. Aaron wrote this like really nice little mini essay, which I'm happy to share, which is what I was saying at the beginning about this kind of conceptual genealogy. So if it's okay, I would like to share that with everyone later.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So yeah, so I'm really happy that we've had these interventions. I really didn't want this to be like this kind of presentation thing. So it's so thankful for those fabulous kind of interventions. And let me just say something real quick. Obviously also instinct or drive or trieb is also mentioned at the end of section 1. And there is a certain sense in which I can just read where it is for reference. This is literally like the page before or as section 1 ends. Okay. Of the old conflict which ended in repression, a new breach has occurred in the pleasure principle at the very time when certain instincts, drives were endeavoring in accordance with the principle to obtain fresh pleasure. The details of the process by which repression turns a possibility of pleasure into a source of unpleasure are not clearly understood and cannot be clearly represented. Okay. However, there is no doubt that all neurotic unpleasure is of that kind, pleasure that cannot be felt as such. So here we have like a really kind of enigmatic point. I love this point, pleasure that cannot be felt as such. It really reminds me of Schuster's The Trouble with Pleasure, which he very much links this statement to a much wider argument around pleasure. But this is what is animating this text, I would say, in many, many ways, right? Which is, how do we describe the elusive nature of the elusive principle of that drive propulsion, right? And for which the issue of time, constancy, internal, external barrier, all of these things need to be mapped and need to be kind of graphed, I think, and we will hopefully do that in the future. So excellent points. I've tried to jot all of these points down as you mentioned them. Are there other interventions before we move to section 2?
I don't know if it's redundant. I didn't want to bog anything down. I just had 2 brief notes on section 1.
Go ahead.
Issues Freud raises there. One is he talks about.
What's your name?
Oh yes, Aaron. Sorry. Let me pull this up. He notes, well, for one, these possible source of unpleasure arising from a splitting in the mental apparatus. It is these individual drives are then split off from that unity through the process of repression. If they then succeed, as can easily occur with repressed sexual drives, this may provide an occasion for that is felt by the ego as unpleasure, et cetera, et cetera. This is, you can find, if you want to know what this entails clinically, the paper that Freud wrote just the year before, A Child is Being Beaten, is an excellent demonstration of this. That is where some component of the sexual instinct, as he puts it, becomes, makes itself, quote, prematurely independent and fixated. And it gives rise to this sadistic and then later masochistic erotic fantasy that is, of course, a great source of unpleasure to everyone to all of its subjects. And then the other thing, Daniel, you just mentioned that pleasure that cannot be felt as pleasure. I couldn't help but, I think the kind of pithiest summation of this is probably in the Ratman case, where Freud notes that his patient experiences horror at the pleasure of which he himself is unaware.
Yeah, very nice. And in the excerpt I gave you from Lacan on 4 fundamental concepts, A Child is Being Beaten, his analysis of this famous case, a dream, appears there. Although, unfortunately, I didn't include it in my excerpt. I apologize. But it's on the Automaton section. So I'm happy to actually share the whole text of the 4 fundamental concepts where that appears for those that wish to look at it. Because it's very much not only related to masochistic and sadistic fantasies, but A Child is Being Beaten is also related to repetition compulsion, right? And I think that by the time of section 2, where Freud is getting to is not yet death drive. It's not yet invented. It's not yet laid out on the table. Again, he's kind of inventing this as he goes in some sense. But repetition compulsion is, right? And so the 3 things, the traumatic neuroses, dreams, and children's play, all have a certain logic of repetition compulsion, right? That can be kind of formalized, right? And he says the best example is obviously children's play, right? Lacan really homes in on this point around the notion of a child as being beaten, around the way in which the dream functions as a cover. it's an incredibly rich reading. I highly recommend. I was just reading it this morning, actually. So thank you for those really nice points, including the Ratman example. Other interventions or thoughts? What do you make of this notion of the interest that Freud has in perceptual order? I know many commentators on BPP have really mentioned that, and I think Kopjek, Aaron, you mentioned Kopjek really talks about this a lot in her reading, which is by the time Freud develops death drive, it is something thought at level of representation and perception, right? So this is this kind of movement, and that you see why, I think right here, why Lacan wants to take Freud into the field of structural linguistics, right? Because if biology and science cannot give an account, right, but it is grounded in the way in which perception makes a mental representation, right, that primary repression is felt through language first, in that sense. You see the linkage, right? So then you see why, for Lacan, Saussure becomes such a significant interlocutor for Freud, and you also see why, in some sense, Freud would have been referencing Saussure in the beginning passages here, if Saussure was available to Freud in that sense, right?
Daniel, Miguel here. May I just put one quick question? I think there's a footnote, if I remember correctly, in which Freud connects pleasure and displeasure to the ego, because they are, by definition, conscious feelings, some feelings that are perceived by the... So what would be a pleasure that cannot be felt as pleasure? Like, is it being enjoyed by someone at some level? Who is the subject who is enjoying this pleasure? Because for the ego, it would be unpleasurable, right? So
I think the neurotic complaint is the classic example of pleasure, which you don't experience as pleasure. You enjoy complaining. It's a pleasure which you have to access in this indirect manner.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
Doesn't Freud make the distinction early on that consciousness only distinguishes qualities and not quantities? And so isn't it that, like, when we think about consciousness, it's not actually getting at this economic magnitude necessarily, but it actually just registers like the pluses and minuses? I think that's like that's a distinction made pretty early on, and maybe that's what's referenced here.
Yeah, that's a very nice point. And I think once we get to Freud's theory of primal repression and the notion of the splitting of the subject, the Spaltung, the division of the subject, I think we can see very clearly that, in some sense, it has to do with the agency of the subject's relationship to the pleasure as such, right? And I think that there is a bigger claim being made, exactly as you say, in the division between the mental biological substrate of the soma, of the body, to consciousness. And I fully agree with that distinction that you, what was your name, who just spoke?
Sam.
Hey, oh, cool. I fully agree with that distinction. Although, do you know where that appears, where he says this business on qualitative versus...
I think it's in the project. I think it's in the Entwerf.
It's in the
right, Aaron? Yeah.
I'm so grateful we have such heavy-hitting Freud scholars on this reading group. This is fabulous. So yeah, Miguel, I think as we proceed, that answer. And obviously, I would point your attention to Robert Fowler, because this is his whole notion of his recent book on pleasure and the problem of pleasure. And I think that he's done probably the most, next to maybe Zizek, on pointing out the lingering neurotic structures of this kind of disembodied pleasure, right? Obviously, canned laughter is one such example, but I think these cute pop culture examples only go so far, because at this level of what Freud's giving us, he's really talking, I think, about a much more fundamental structure of subjectivity is what he's developing, you know? So, yeah, I think we will hopefully get a better grasp on that, unless others want to jump in on Miguel's nice question around this notion of what are examples of pleasure that cannot be felt, or pleasure that's not in the possession of the subject. It's an interesting point.
I mean, hysterical protest seems like a pretty good example. You know, Dora's, say, complicity in everything she complains about in the world. Her supervillain protest, yes.
Where does pleasure come into play there, though?
Or not pleasure.
Or where does pleasure not come into play there? Yeah. Well,
I think that what happens is that when you work with patients, you find people who fall into the same patterns in their lives, and they can be very unpleasurable or unhappy for them. But pleasure and unpleasure aren't necessarily the right words for making this distinction. Lacan is correct that we need to speak about satisfaction in addition to pleasure, unpleasure. People can be satisfied with unpleasure. And that's really what Freud is getting at here with this question of neurotic unpleasure. And it's also why Deleuze will say that the pleasure, unpleasure, this complex has to be thought independently of pain. It has nothing to do with pain.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Johnny here. Just a quick question. How does this, I mean, to Miguel's question, I mean, would something like, just trying to formulate it within my own thoughts, would something like the current hysteria, like the hysterical complaint that I believe, sorry, I forgot your name, but you've made excellent points. The hysterical complaint of like Donald Trump is going to do a coup. Isn't that like the pleasure, like the unpleasurable, the pleasure that's found with an ultimate climax of some sort? I'm not to bring left Twitter into this, but like the sort of like climactic, like it's unpleasurable that Donald Trump would do a coup, but nonetheless, the invocation of that, of an apocalypse of isn't that in some form like a form of jouissance, or is that totally something unrelated?
I think it, and to a certain extent it can hold, but I think that the key point I would hone in on is, you know, why is it in the Fort Daw game that the child is choosing the direction of the activity of the game they've invented to be structured around mastering the unpleasurable repetition of the absence of the mother, right? Clearly this indicates that in the example of children's play, it's not something which is dictated by the pleasure principle, right? But that doesn't mean that it's reducible, that all children's play is reducible to a kind of sunk masochism either, right? It means that there's a sort of structural logic at play, right? Which is going to be developed around how one handles repression, right? So that's one way to get at it, but I invite others to respond to that in the interest of getting examples on the table, you know? Always important to do. Okay. Well, Johnny, hopefully that satisfies your question. No, but I wonder what you mean by the Trump thing. Can you say more about this kind of notion of Trump? What was your specific thinking in that?
I was thinking about pain from pleasure, or pleasure from pain. This, like, the figure of Donald Trump in the liberal mindset of he's such a gauche figure, but at the same time he's necessary for, like, to repeat the constant, like, invocation of him as a figure that will cause a climactic, like, turnaround. And, like, I think throughout these 4 years, as we're entering 2020, there's this, like, notion that, like, there's a coming apocalypse, there's coming fascism, and all the contradictions will be sort of leveled out at I'm not making a whole bunch of sense, but I guess I was trying to think of it in terms of the pleasure that comes from no pleasure of invocating something that continually brings you down or makes you, and I think the neurotic complaint and the hysterical protest are both probably excellent examples. I was just trying to think of it in terms of politics.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. I mean, I think that we lose track of the fact that we still, I think in many regards, have very much a neurotic civilization, right? That we're sort of not, that like psychic life still is sort of predominantly neurotic in a certain sense. And so I certainly agree. And I think that a sort of general framework of the neurotic subject is one for whom the proximity of otherness is always unresolvable or is always problematic, right? It's like one way that I always like to formulate that. Whereas for psychosis, you have a kind of foreclosure or a removal of otherness, right? So in that sense, I'm almost more interested in the kind of becoming psychosis of the political American scene, which liberals, I think in many senses, are incapable of actually becoming full psychotics, right? So I don't know, maybe it would do them some good in a certain sense to think that to escape the fantasy that they can constantly control the other, right? Okay, let's move to section 2. I think we've raised some really fabulous points, just sort of some getting our bearings straight kind of points. So Freud opens this section discussing the traumatic neuroses and pointing out how since the dawn of psychoanalysis, the hysteric subject, the next subject that became of profound interest to him were veterans from the First World War. And he points out that the sort of fact that the ones who were actually wounded at the body tended not to exhibit the same dramatic or intense war neuroses as those who witnessed an accident. And the way that I frame this, and please, I invite others to sort of enter in here, because we're thinking again of soma, we're thinking of body in relationship to consciousness, we're thinking of that fabulous distinction. We're also thinking really of mediation, right? We're thinking the mediation of the scene of the accident. And seems to me that with the very aperture of the talking cure, it makes a great deal of sense why one who has access to the mediation of a physical wound would be able to process that event more resolutely. Do people agree with that, or sort of how do you take this point? There's so much to be said, and Freud does write about it elsewhere, but I wonder if anybody wants to jump in on this.
Something that's physical, I mean, that jumps to my mind. I just watched The Lobster by Yorgos Lanthimos, the director Yorgos Lanthimos, last night, and sort of the idea that blindness, the other senses are heightened as a result of one's blindness. The body sort of always necessarily like coming to a conclusion of sorts about, whereas psychic damage isn't as easily foreclosed, like you were saying. But the first example that comes to mind is blindness for me. I mean, maybe that's a cliche. I've never been blind, obviously, and yeah.
Aaron, other than a compensation, as it were, I think that you might link this with other parts of the text. Again, I'm not that familiar with Brassier's reading, only secondhand, but I know what he stresses is the idea, or to abridge this, that, you know, a primitive organism has to, in order to, you know, prevent being overwhelmed by external stimuli, it has to kill off a part of itself. It has to mortify itself, or at least some part of itself, to form this impermeable barrier. And I mean, you could, that would be like a very strong, almost, I dare I say, kind of physicalist reading of the war trauma, though I think what you were touching on, Daniel, is interesting, and it's kind of confounding. I don't know how to kind of make sense of it, but the notion of this providing a kind of necessary symbolization, as it were. Maybe symbolization is too strong, but symbolization as it relates to the body. You had mentioned this answering to certain clinical problems with neurotics. I'm curious what you had in mind there.
Well, first of all, I think that, thank you for reminding me that Ray Brassier is a really exceptionally good reader of this text and of Freud in general. Of Lacan, but really he's a reader of Freud, I would say, more so in certain sense. No, I was just trying to help Johnny with this understanding of a kind of general neurotic subject, and for the nexus of Freud's time, the neurotic subject was paramount, was the most common, and I think that there's a certain sense in post-Lacanian circles that today we sort of experience, you know, a kind of the borderline, and that there's a kind of fracturing, and that the three structures are all over the map, right? But I think actually there's a certain sense in which we still are very much a neurotic culture, right? Is all I was trying to say. Not even thinking about certain case studies per se, but I agree though. Yes, this business of body and overcoming trauma will return. And Freud is sort of just introducing this because he's wanting to talk about traumatic neuroses, right? And he then shifts to the question of dreams, because it is in dream work precisely where the resolution occurs for the war neurotics, right? He says, quote, "The study of dreams may be regarded as the most trustworthy approach to the exploration of deeper psychic processes. In the traumatic neuroses, the dream life has this peculiarity. It continually makes the patient takes the patient back to the situation of his disaster, from which he awakens in a renewed terror." So in this sense, the dream, you can see why its unresolved status would be, its repetition compulsion would be more prominent for the one who was not physically wounded. Why? Because the fright of that event seems to almost cause an impossible mediation, right? Where the sort of subject is constantly wanting, its unconscious is constantly revisiting it, seeking some mediation for which it never fully achieves. This fact has caused less surprise than it merits. The obtrusion on the patient over and again, even in sleep, of the impression made by the traumatic experience is taken as being merely a proof of its strength. The patient has, so to speak, undergone a psychical fixation as to the trauma. Fixations of this kind on the experience which has brought about the malady have long been known to us in connection with hysteria. We, in 1893, argued that hysterics suffer from reminiscences. So here, and I love this point about reminiscence versus repetition as a sort of huge motif, both obviously in philosophy. You have Plato's theory of reminiscence, which is very like the cornerstone of Platonic theory of truth in some sense. And then you have Kierkegaard and the kind of great anti-philosophical tradition of repetition being primary, right? And how Freud intervenes in that philosophical debate is very interesting. And we'll see that in section 3, even more so. So yes, so the war neuroses indicates that the traumatic point, the point of the wound, whether physical or psychical, is a point of repetition, in this case in dreams. Okay. Without the intention of making a comprehensive study of these phenomena, I availed myself of an opportunity which offered, wait, are we already, okay, so we're already done, yeah, so this is how short this is. So that's, first he talks about neuroses, then he talks about dreams, and now here we are already at the third example of children's games. So this is actually the bulk of what I wanted to talk about today. I spent most of my time preparing for the Fort Da example. Before I get into it, is there any points that we need to make about everything we've talked about so far? Okay.
Hi, this is, oh, sorry.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Cade. And this is more just even like a passing thought, kind of going off of Johnny a little bit even. But when it's brought about, like the distinctions between apprehension, fear, and fright, and how fright seems to be the only thing that brings out the fright neurosis or the associated with the war trauma, I'm thinking a little bit, and it's simplified because I don't grasp it entirely, of Zupancic's What is Sex somewhat, where it seems like there's a correlation between sex and like the uninscribable, or what isn't able to be made sense of, has a certain quality of repetition to it. And so thinking of like the hysteria at like an assumed catastrophic event, like a Trump coup or something like that, I'm wondering if there's something sexual in that nature of anticipating, like strangely anticipating a fright and being drawn to it in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. So you're saying, is there a logic in which the lingering notion of structure of fright creeps over into other kind of newly traumatic experiences, as I understand what you said? That's a very interesting point. In other words, is there something of the prior fright present in my future accidental fright moments? I witness a horrific accident or something. Is that what you're saying in a certain sense? Is it sort of a kind of tapestry that has some connection in some sense? Is that what you're
like almost like an adrenaline junkie type thing, where you put yourself in a situation where you're anticipating a fright somewhat, or that's what you read the situation as and drive some sort of enjoyment of that before the fact?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually going to be present in the notion of games, right? And even in horror and the experience of horror, it has to do with a game of the fortification of the agency and the kind of the notion that the ooh and the ah, the exit and the there, right? The movement and then the I've established it, like the excitation that comes with that, in certain sense, is a kind of leap, right? It is a leap of a discovery. And this is why I was saying this business of Deleuze found so interesting, the abyssal leap. And here, I do think that, yes, the Pascalian Kierkegaardian notion of leap is here present. So I think it's certainly there. I want to say, though, hopefully that answers your question, Kate, but I do want to say that, like, this whole business of the Fort Da is super weird because did you notice that Freud does not admit that it's his own child, or like that it's his daughter's child? And there is a reading from a pretty interesting American philosopher who really says that Freud omitted that information for two reasons. One, he wanted to ground it in a kind of scientific authority, right? Like it could be any example, it's more universal, right? And two, apparently Freud's daughter Sophie had died. I think that was the case. So there was a certain trauma that Freud himself was experiencing. It's sort of interesting that he chose that example.
I'd be remiss, Aaron, here, if I didn't mention on the subject of Sophie Freud's death, there was actually just a lecture by Jacqueline Rose yesterday for the Freud Museum on Beyond the Pleasure Principle.
Oh, really?
And on the impact of Sophie's death. I haven't had the chance to listen through to it yet, but I like Jacqueline.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So let me just say a couple of things here before I actually go into the example. This actually will preface a little bit from Derrida's reading of the Fourth Dawn, which is that Derrida spends a lot of time focusing here on how Freud establishes to the reader, to his public, his own participation in the example he's citing of the game of the child, right? And what Derrida wishes to point out here is that, in fact, Freud was not just a passive observer of this example that he's illustrating, but really was sort of an architect of it in a certain sense. So that's very significant for Derrida, because what that means is that the origin, in a certain sense, of the beyond of the pleasure principle, because here we're really getting the closest formalization of it that we've gotten thus far, is an autobiographical origin, right? And it is still, because there is this tacit denial of his own intricate role and the fact that it's from his own family, Derrida then argues that this is a sign that Freud is still undergoing a self-analysis. So I think for many of us, we're very upset that he makes this claim. Maybe not, I don't know. So anyways, so let's get into it. Okay, I thought that was interesting.
Sorry, Bradshaw, just before you go there, I wanted to mention that this question of fright, it comes up with anxiety and fear, which seem to be different states, but fright designates a speed, a suddenness, which goes back to this question. I mean, it's a point that Freud brings up just at the beginning about quantity of excitation in a given period of time, speed, and it recurs in the very last pages of Beyond the Pleasure Principle as well. He says that he's been forced actually to countenance this kind of accelerated notion, or the suddenness. But the Fort Daw game is important, and what's happening here in section 2 is that Freud is explaining why the traumatic neuroses are a kind of challenge to psychoanalysis. In 1900, in the interpretation of dreams, Freud says that dreams are wish fulfillment. And here he tells you, anyone who thinks it's self-evident that you should be put back in your dreams into states of fright has not understood what is a wish fulfilled. So he's really kind of twisting himself in a way to accommodate these dreams, these neuroses. And it's always this element of speed or suddenness, of differentiation, which seems to be at stake. And yeah, I'll let you. There's something else I want to say, but I'll let you talk about Fort Daw. You might get it.
No. Thank you so much. Really excellent interventions. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the text. So, without the intention of making a comprehensive study of these phenomena, I availed myself of an opportunity which offered of elucidating the first game invented by himself of a boy 18 months old. And this is after the mirror stage, I think, technically, right? Just as an FYI. It was more than a casual observation, for I lived for some weeks under the same roof as the child and his parents, and it was a considerable time before the meaning of his puzzling and continually repeated performance became clear to me. The child was in no respect forward in his intellectual development. At 18 months, he spoke only a few intelligible words, making besides sundry significant sounds which were understood by those about him. But he made himself understood by his parents and the maidservant, and had a good reputation for behaving properly. He did not disturb his parents at night. He scrupulously obeyed orders about not touching various objects and not going into certain rooms. And above all, he never cried when his mother went out and left him for hours together. Although the tie to his mother was a very close one, she had not only nourished him herself, but had cared for him and brought him up without any outside help. Okay. So a couple points here. Freud links the notion of the game to, again, the theme of economic compensation, which we've already been introduced to, because it's largely about the instantiation of presence and absence, as we'll see. Occasionally, however, this well-behaved child evinced the troublesome habit of flinging into the corner of the room or under the bed all the little things he could lay his hands on, so that to gather up his toys was often no light task. He accompanied this by an expression of interest and gratification, emitting a loud, long drawn out ooh, which in the judgment of the mother, one that coincided with my own, was not an interjection, but meant go away. So the ooh is the fort, that is away. I saw at last that this was a game and that the child used all his toys only to play being gone, fort sign, with them. One day I made an observation that confirmed my view. The child had a wooden reel with a piece of string wound round it. It never occurred to him, for example, to drag this after him on the floor and so play horse and cart with it. But he kept throwing it with considerable skill. And every time he did, he would say, ooh, and drew the reel by the string out of the cot again, greeting its reappearance with the joyful da, there. This was therefore the complete game, disappearance and return, the first act being the only one generally observed by the onlookers and the one entirely repeated by the child. So you see, it's kind of like a yo-yo string that you sort of attach objects to. It goes out and back to you, right? Okay, so I've made these points on the side there. The analysis of a single case of this kind yields no sure conclusion. On impartial consideration, one gains the impression that it is from another motive that the child has turned this experience into a game. He was in the first place passive, was overtaken by the experience, but now he brings himself in as playing an active part by repeating the experience as a game in spite of its unpleasing nature. This effort might be ascribed to the impulse to obtain the mastery of a situation, a power instinct, which remains independent of any question of the recollection. But another interpretation may be attempted. The flinging away of the object so that it is gone might be the gratification of an impulse of revenge, suppressed in real life. Yes, you can go. I don't want you. I am sending you away myself. The same child a year later, than many observations used to throw on the floor a toy, to say, go to the war. He had been told that his absent father was at the war. So that you can see the similar structure there. One is left in doubt whether the compulsion to work over in psychic life what has made a deep impression to make oneself fully master of it can express itself primarily and independently of the pleasure principle. In the case discussed here, however, the child might have repeated a disagreeable impression in play only because with the repetition was bound up a pleasure gain of a different kind but more direct. Okay. So, very interesting points. I think this last point is probably our best example of where the logic of repetition compulsion is hinged on. We see that on the one hand, there is a beyond, which is a kind of risky beyond, a kind of wager that the child has created through, and this is very important, especially for Lacan, the physical device. Lacan will literally call that physical device of the child the objet, right? The apparatus, right? So that's very significant. But from this example, we are dealing with an opportunity to sort of formalize the theory of primal repression on the one hand, and we're also able to theorize the birth of signification for Lacan. So in the readings that I had us look at, Lacan does just that. So he really gleans quite a lot from this. But before we get into that, I just wanted to make a couple sort of general points. So the first thing to note here is that, and Derrida picks up on this and others have as well, is that it's actually unclear whether the absence or the presence, which one is first in sequence, right? Because in some sense, the presence, it's very interesting that the one of the presence, the achievement, the there of the ooh, is secondary and not primary. That's a very interesting dialectical point. The other point is that Freud says that life disappears there, right? So at the point of the fort not being the da, the fort is the da. So being there before the emergence of life, the repetitive movement of the drives is retraced to the one single self-identical origin, the fort, which was there and is there and will be there before, during, and after all is said and done. So this has led some to say that the fort, the origin of this movement, because again, Freud will develop a theory of both the origin of the fort being both on the side of consciousness, but also of life, and the kind of unique interconnectivity of the two. It is a point where neither the living nor light can ever emerge from. Now, it is also the point, and Ernst Jones will say this later, where Freud interjects, and this goes back to the self-biography piece, autobiography piece, where Freud interjects the father image of himself into the fort, right? For Derrida, it is, in some sense, the place where no trace can emerge. And those who are appreciative of his philosophy understand the importance of trace, and why precisely Derrida is so hostile of Freud's fort da is precisely the lack of it. Let me also make a point that this is, for materialists, like let's say Zizek, the fort da instantiates a notion of a materialist, even a Kleinemann. Lacan will say this in the Four Fundamental Concepts, that the fort da displays, and if those of you are not familiar with the notion of Kleinemann from Greek atomism, the Greek atomists had the notion that there is a kind of swerving atom, which out of chaos produces a kind of accidental order, right? But it is from a kind of void of interacting multiplicities, a sort of swerving atom creates a kind of retroactive. So what I'm trying to say to you is that the dialectical relationship between the fort and the da brings such profound, it's the origin point of everything that is speculative about this text. Okay, so that's my little crazy philosophical interlude. And this is a picture of Freud and his daughter with the boy. Okay, let us move to Lacan. So,
wait, can we?
Please.
Can I ask a quick thing about why we didn't do like the active passive bit?
Sure. Let me go back to that. Please. Well, I'm going to get into it in a moment, but go on.
Oh, okay. No, it's okay. I just thought we would do it as part of it, but if we'll get back to it.
No. What did you wish to say about it?
Oh, I just felt like it was like this weird Aristotelian moment that doesn't necessarily get picked up on. And like, I just see all these, I'm doing social work and psychoanalytic training right now. So like, I see a lot of this interpretation of like mastery, right? Which Freud is sort of saying it's not, that this is not this sort of like drive to mastery in repetition. In the repetition compulsion, it's not mastery. And so he posits this alternative, which has to do with the move from passive to active.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what I'm kind of interested in exploring further. Both like what if people think that there's like a weird Aristotelian notion or concept of it, or if it's like, how does it, I mean, how it gets put into Lacan's sort of symbolization?
Yeah, I think at this point we might have to move to the master himself. But you're right. I think Freud leaves open, let's call it like a vulgar ego psychoanalytic reading here, right? By not saying that, oh yeah, we can reduce this to the power instinct, right? Or that it's all about the ego's agency, right? I think that's why this text probably frustrates a lot of people in the psychoanalytic community, right? Who are very like egocentric in a certain, not literally, but you know, in their theories, right? And as I was saying in the beginning, why this text sort of becomes a problem for a lot of people. But also why I would also add that there is a, aside from the materialist reading and the kind of Derridian, Ernst Jones biographical overdetermination reading, we should also be honest that there is a mystical reading. I mean, I don't know if you guys read Norman O'Brown, the great American Freudian. I mean, for him, this notion of Fort Da is a kind of mystical origin point. It's kind of this sort of Van Morrison, beyond the vistas, you know, whatever kind of thing, fully naturalized. I mean, he has no interest in talking about the material instantiation of language or anything like that. He doesn't read Lacan at all, right? So there's a certain mystical direction, even though Jung is kind of not really in the picture in a certain sense. You can kind of sort of reincorporate a mystical Freudianism from Beyond the Pleasure Principle, I wish to suggest. I don't know if anyone agrees with that.
Aaron here. I just want to add one other potential reading at this moment. I'm kind of engaged in a debate, as it were, with Mikhail Borsch-Jakobson, whose thesis in the Freudian subject is one of a kind of, essentially he takes his bearings from a Girardian metapsychology, which posits that desire is always secondary to identification, that desire is always modeled and so forth. And so that essentially the unconscious consists in just identification. If no dreams are, for instance, lived out from the person themselves, they always seem to be, you know, taking the guise of someone else. And he doesn't think this is just a compromise formation, something to get around the dream sensor, for instance, but it is the very activity of the unconscious, that this kind of primordial opacity consists in my identification with the other. And hence his reading really stresses this kind of revenge aspect of the Fort Da. It's like, oh, you dispose of me. Well, fuck you. I'm going to reenact what you do to me. I'm going to take your place literally in my fantasy and dispose of you as you of myself. And indeed, for Borsch-Jakobson, this kind of fundamental identification explains the odd convergence of unpleasure with desire. It's a, well, I mean, it's a fascinating argument. I think it's terribly simplistic, though, especially once you just take into account later developments. But at this stage, I think it is one that's, I don't know, bears, warrants grappling with.
Mm-hmm.
On this passive-active question, I wanted to point out that yes, it is. Freud says, you know, no, it's not this instinct for mastery, but then he's not very persuasive about it, is he? But he does say actually what it is instead. It's not an instinct to mastery that prevails here. On the other hand, it is obvious that all their play is influenced by a wish that dominates them the whole time, the wish to be grown up and be able to do what grown-up people do. What he's saying there is that the human organism doesn't come out sort of with these predetermined ends or goals. It doesn't become a master of its own house. The house has to be built by someone first who tells them what to do. There have to be grown-ups. And ultimately what matters is not the instinct to master anything, which may or may not happen, but rather this wish, this desire to be grown up, or whatever a grown up is. Who knows what a grown up is? But this mastery instinct versus the wish to master comes to a point that I think is on page 15 in the footnote, he makes a further observation, which he says confirms his interpretation fully. One day, the child's mother had been away for several hours, and on her return was met with the words, "Baby, ooh," which was at first incomprehensible. It soon turned out, however, that during this long period of solitude, the child had found a method of making himself disappear. So in a mastery instinct, what prevails is the ego over everything else. In this wish for mastery, in the wish to be the master, it's not about the ego prevailing, it's about the ego disappearing. There's a magic trick that happens, and this is the puzzle of narcissism. It's why Jean Laplanche, for example, says that everything that Freud writes after this narcissism essay is a disaster. Laplanche wants to totally erase everything after narcissism, but the puzzle of narcissism is either I only see myself, I exclude the rest of the world, or on the other hand, I see myself in everything. I am the world. Narcissism cuts in both of these directions, but it's not clear how or in what way. And this question of mastery, it's implicit, more or less. It's latent, I think, here. But what Freud is trying to get at is that there's a wish, a desire, which is important, not the instinct or the capacity to be a master.
Aaron here, I just want to add one thing to the kind of Laplanchian reading of narcissism. I mean, it's remarkably similar to Boris Jakobson's own claims, you know, either I debase myself entirely before the other, I totally divest myself of personality, or I just project myself outward. And Kopjek has an interesting answer to this, and Read My Desire, and not Read My Desire, Imagine There's No Woman, building on Laplanche's point that sublimation is actually what gives rise to primary narcissism, as opposed to secondary narcissism, which is more properly egoism. And that is that you have to insert narcissism at the level of the drive, that it instantiates, to quote Leo Steinberg's line about Jasper Johns, you can't tell the difference between what you bring to the object and what it gives back.
Excellent. So let's move to Lacan's reading of the fourth Tao. Let me just say that Lacan mentions this game quite a lot. In the Écrit, there are multiple reference points in the Purloined Letter, the function and field of speech, and elsewhere, and you know, not to mention in many seminars. And I gave you excerpts from the seminar on fantasy, and obviously from the four fundamental concepts where it's elaborated, I think, the most. The most significant point that Lacan will derive from this, I believe, is the idea that you have, and although Lacan does not want to use the term agency, it is something of the achievement of a new subjective humanization of desire. You could say agency if you like, but it is an achievement both of symbolization for the child, but if we think about the Fort Daw game vis-a-vis the structure of the Oedipus complex, which I will turn to in a moment, that actually really helps us understand how the game performs something of an achievement for the child's relationship of autonomy, if you like, to their own desire, right? But also sets up the sort of preconditions for the child's relationship to the field of signification as such. So a lot's going on with this game, nonetheless. So the object the child makes appear and disappear is actually less important for Lacan than the phonemic distinction of the oo and the ah. It is the point of an insemination for a symbolic order that pre-exists the infantile subject. And again, pre-exists. Why is it, how do you pronounce is it tuke? Tuk, from the Greek Aristotelian notion of the automaton, am I pronouncing it correctly? Tuke? Does anybody know? I tried to look it up, but I couldn't find it because it's actually not a Greek word. Maybe no one else knows. Okay, that's good. I'm not the only idiot here then. But the notion that the symbolic order in which the subject is being introduced has a pre-existent status goes back to this notion of the kind of speculative abyssal foundation of what will be Death Drive, right? Or of Freud's entire project, which we talked about at the beginning. So this excerpt here is from the Ecrit. Actually, this is from the seminar on Edgar Allan Poe, towards the end of it. So you'll see that he says, quote, "Fort da, it is already when quite alone that the desire of the human child becomes the desire of another, of an alter ego, who dominates him and whose object of desire is henceforth his own affliction. Should the child now address an imaginary or a real partner, he will see that this partner too obeys the negativity of his discourse. And since his call has the effect of making the partner slip away, he will seek to bring about the reversal that brings the partner back to his desire through a banishing summons. Thus the symbol first manifests itself as the killing of the thing. And this death results in an endless perpetuation of the subject's desire." So I think you can see what is it that's being killed, first of all. What is it that's being killed? It is the traumatic event, which would otherwise be a repetition compulsion of the absence of the mother, a kind of enigmatic X, right? That is what's being brought up, right? And I
Isn't
think,
it like the mother's already dead? Like, and
sorry, who's talking? Sorry.
oh, this is Sam. I was just thinking, like, isn't there that line where when the child's mother dies, it's like he's, the boy shows no grief. I was thinking that's kind of an interesting.
So where does that appear?
It's Freud's note on. I'm actually using the Richter translation, but 59 of that one.
You want to read it, please?
Sure. Yeah, when the child was 5 years and 9 months old, his mother died. Now that she was really, in quotes, gone, the boy showed no grief over her. Indeed, a second child had been born in the meantime and had awakened in him the strongest jealousy. Freud's note.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think the mother's not dead at the point of this example, though, right? Of the Fort Da in its initial presentation, right? Right?
No.
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So we've already established for Lacan that the issue of the game enacts the humanization of desire, the introduction of symbolization, which we'll get to in a moment. However, this excerpt I wish to read aloud from the Touquet and the Automaton. So this real is not the mother reduced to a little ball. And again, the real is the physical object that the child has used to put the string on, to take the objects, to create the ou effect, to create the away effect. It is a small part of the subject that detaches itself from him while still remaining his, still retained. This is the place to say, in imitation of Aristotle, that man thinks with his object. It is with his object that the child leaps the frontiers of his domain, transformed into a well, and begins the incantation. It is true, I love this quasi-theological stuff. It is true that the signifier is the first mark of the subject. How can we fail to recognize here, from the very fact that this game is accompanied by one of the first oppositions to appear, that it is in the object to which the opposition is applied in act, the real, not real, but real like the device, that we must designate the subject. To this object, we will later give the name it bears in the Lacanian algebra, the petit a. The activity as a whole symbolizes repetition, but not at all that of some need that might demand the return of the mother, and which would be expressed quite simply in a cry. It is the repetition of the mother's departure as cause of a spalting in the subject, which is a division in the subject, overcome by the alternating game, away, there, there. So you see the duality, right? A here or there. I kind of prefer away, like and I think Deleuze much prefers this notion of exit, and whose aim in its alternation is simply that of being the fort of a da, the da of a fort. It is aimed at what essentially is not there qua represented, for it is the game itself that is the representans of the Vorstellung. What will become of the Vorstellung when, once again, this representans of the mother in her outline made up of the brushstrokes and the gouges of desire will be lacking. So, very interesting. We have a kind of dual level operation of representation that's taking place. I've noted here, I think this is worth pointing out here, that there's three significant points of Fort Da for Lacan. First is the verbal communication of the Fort Da by connecting the event with signifiers, absence and reappearance. Second, the fact that the erasure of the thing is the precondition for symbolization, what Lacan calls making an effigy of the mother, taking the enigmatic desire of the mother's absence and turning it into an efficacy or an effigy, is the second point. Third, you also have the notion of substitution, which is taking place. So why is substitution important? Well, in some sense, and I could actually graph this, I may be able to, let me see if I can do this real quick. If I go to, sorry, this may not work, but it may work at the same time. So if I stop share and then I go share screen and I go here, and then I go share, and then I have, okay, cool. Can you see that? Does that work? Yeah. So you have a couple ways to graph this, and this is, I think, helpful. So you have a certain introduction of the spoken chain, which is itself, as you all know, a metonymy. So the S1 here being the enigmatic origin point of the mother is converted into an S2, but that S has a relationship which Lacan graphs like this: S2 over barred 1, X, S2, and then U. U stands for unconscious, and X stands for the enigmatic origin point of the pure pleasure of unification with the mother's desire, right? So in that sense, what the S2 represents is precisely what Lacan calls, oh, whoops, sorry, hold on. The necessary spalting or splitting of the subject, right? So the Fort Da game is the achievement of this, which, what is your name again? Who you articulated it so well, my friend, I forget your name. You were mentioning this vision of how the presentation is not reducible to this notion of ego psychology of agency and so on and so forth, but is actually, what's your name again?
Sam.
Yeah, is actually about the development of the split subject, and S2 is the split subject. I apologize, this doesn't read exactly wonderfully, but this is my first time doing it. So S2 is also following the logic of substitution. Substitution, so all of that then would be primal repression is the necessary precondition for entering into a relationship to a signifier as such. Seems to be Lacan's point. Now, I wish I could bring up my other slides here that summarize that a little bit more. But in essence, the Fort Da has to do with the necessary creation of a lack, right? So when the child says Fort Da, the child disappears in being, right? And the child basically reemerges as an effect of language, right? So here we're sort of realizing that the tuque, what Lacan calls this residue of eros, or the legacy of the Aristotelian notion of repetition, is best understood as these moments of symbolization whereby repetition hits or has an encounter with a real, right? And I like the fact that the real of the object of the game has a sounds the same as real in some sense, because it's not the same, but it allows for a touch with the real, if you like, a touch with the X, right? So that's how Lacan will actually graph it. But it looks incredibly ugly, so I might actually stop the show. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yes, I just had a question about the engendering a necessary lack. Could you say that this is engendering the very necessary lack in the in mother, capital O, other? Because I know that Lacan reads Fort Da somewhat along these lines. I mean, he views it as a very inadequate initial means of symbolization on the part of the child. But I think he says in Seminar 5, Formations of the Unconscious, that this is a way of reaching the mother's, quote, beyond, and way of beginning to escape this anxiety-provoking subjectivization. And so this is also equally a way of beginning to symbolize the mother's desire and to evade her desire, because it's, of course, a huge source of anxiety for the child.
Yeah, I think for those of us that are less familiar with Lacan's general view of Oedipus, what we also have at play here, in addition to everything Aaron just mentioned, is also the achievement of the proper metaphorization, right? So for Lacan, entering into language, this notion here of the, what we say, spoken chain or signifying chain, is a metonymic relationship. A subject represents a subject to another signifier. So it's a sort of depersonalized, almost intrinsically alienating experience to enter into the spoken chain, right? But it is one which is necessary for the development of the child. And the precondition of that entering into requires the sort of making a metaphor also of the phallus, right? And the question of the possession of the phallus between the mother and the father, which is very important. And so what's also at play here is the metaphorization of being as having, right? And the distinction of having, like, why is it, as our friend Sam mentioned, that the exit of the child is one of moving away from being? Because being is not on the side of the signifier, it's on the side of the kind of enigmatic desire of the mother, right? And so there is a sort of movement, and that movement is necessary also by the interdiction of the father's role in helping to metaphorize that desire, right? So there is a certain paternal metaphor, I think, or even the name of the father that also could be mapped onto this as a necessary feature. And obviously we need to talk about the notion of Oedipus as a type of, a conflict over possession of the phallus, right? And all of the kind of dangers and conflicts that come within families and within the life of a child around this kind of turbulent notion of possession of phallus. But I think it's clear to me that Lacan is making the argument that split subjectivity is a necessary introduction to this, this field of language as such, right? But that then introduces a whole new terrain of alienation, right? It's like the alienation is redoubled and layered, right? But let me, please.
Is the S1 the paternal signifier, or is it something akin to? I've heard the notion of a unary signifier, like a nonsensical, like it's relative. I guess my question is S1 here basically it could be whatever, or it can be anything, but it has to instantiate the idea of there, or I guess my question is what S1 here is fort or da, is it a paternal signifier?
Yeah, this is part of the ambiguity of the notion of presence and absence. Which one is primary? It's not exactly clear, or it's not exactly like this is certain fundamental ambiguity that I think many people have picked up on. But I think in general, the S1 would be the non-alienated position of the child before they have even endeavored to throw the X, to throw the object, right? That's how I would answer that. But if I invite others to also jump in.
Daniel, would you care to compare this example of the child with the previous example of the traumatic dreams in terms of this theme of the spoken chain and repetition? So are the dreams repeating themselves because the soldiers can find a metaphor for that traumatic event? Would that be the basic point if we look at it through this Lacanian reading of Freud?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, which is to say that it is possible to resolve the repetition compulsion of a traumatic dream precisely through the work of the talking here, of the analytic session. And one of the things we're going to look at immediately in section 3 is the way in which in the transference, which has not yet come up, we find an extremely further proof of the ambiguity of the origin of the primal repression. Precisely because the primal repression lies on the other side of the subject's unconscious desire, the analyst almost seems to possess a more proximate position vis-a-vis their own interpretation of it, right? So they are like literally bringing it about within the analytic session. And that itself, that bringing it out actually creates a kind of proof of its existence, even though it's not something that is of conscious existence for the subject, right? So I think we'll actually get into the way in which the dream functions in analysis through transference in section 3, before we introduce death drive and so on, which is where we can answer this question with more precision, I believe. But let me actually share this other screen with you very quickly, which is even better, because I try to summarize Lacan's key points. So we have somewhat limited time. Let me just go through them. The fourth thought has to do with absence and presence and creation of a lack. When the child says fourth thought, the child disappears in being. It is nothing and emerges as subject, namely as an effective language, as we just tried to demonstrate. So what this allows is the child can now mobilize his desire as a desire of a subject towards objects that substitute for the lost object. That's the key thing. The introduction into the chain of speech, or into the chain of metonymy of other signifiers, you see helps to sort of push down the traumatic X, right? Through substitution, through metonymy. And metonymy simply refers to a system of a kind of horizontal differentiation, right? Where you cannot say, this is the one. So in a signifying chain that's governed by metonymy, you do not have pure signification. It's not possible, right? So the game for Lacan is about a certain mastery of the lost object as such, which is the enigmatic X of the fusion of mother and child, right? And we should note here that Melanie Klein had a radically different view about the notion of fusion of mother and child. Lacan held the view that it's necessary, like a priori necessary, to make a move away from this fusion, right? That a kind of, if you know anything about mirror stage and the construction of the imaginary, you'll know that Lacan's argument is that the child longs to be free from this hold of the enigmatic desire of the mother, that the mother's desire is das Ding, right? It's monstrous, right? So this is a kind of a move that Melanie Klein moves away from, which is, I think, worth noting, because Klein, as I read Lacan as I get older, is like very important for Lacan. Melanie Klein is. She comes up a lot, and she's a silent influence, right? And then we haven't really got into this, but the fact that all symbolization is premised on this kind of necessary erasure of the enigmatic X means that it is a precondition for all symbolization. So therefore, primal repression and then paternal metaphor are very central to the whole procedure. And so, yeah, so I think these are the key points. Now, you'll notice that we have about 2 minutes left, but we have about 20 questions also left. Yeah, about 25 questions. So what we might want to do is kind of go through these very quickly, unless there's any other sort of interventions on Lacan, and I'll share all of these slides and everything.
Real quickly, just because the one line you had up there, the thing must be lost in order to be represented.
Yeah.
I'm going through the sixth seminar with people right now, and in the Hamlet section, there's one part in particular where he talks about mourning as a converse of psychosis, whereas in psychosis, there's a hole in the symbolic that then reappears in hallucinations and reality. That for Lacan, mourning is there being a hole in reality, like a lost other of sorts, that then reappears in the symbolic, and it seems to line up very much so with like the lost object being necessary to instill the chain of signification, but explicitly as like a converse of psychosis. I thought was at least an interesting part.
Oh, interesting. Oh, because in psychosis, the foreclosure of the lost object is permitted.
Where you have a hole in the symbolic is how Lacan puts it, which then returns in hallucinations in reality. And then for mourning, there's a hole in reality of like a lost object or a lost other that then reappears in the level of symbolic. It seems to be like the entry point. He uses the phallus as like the thing to be rejected, to where you can get the object small a, which introduces the symbolic order.
Yeah. So I love this business. Yeah, thank you for that intervention. But I think, as you can see, this is surprisingly of rich philosophical interest. And Aaron, you mentioned that Lacan says it's an inadequate example for thought, but I'd never encountered that. It seems to me that he's very much in favor of it, like as a kind of, I don't know, like a really strong example for symbolization. I don't know, where did you read that, or where did you encounter that?
I just get the impression that, I mean, it's in his 3 moments of Oedipus in 7 or 5. I'm not sure if he says it outright. He just talks about Fordin in connection with the metonymy of the mother and the anxiety-provoking subjectivization. It's a way of coping with it, as it were, but I get the impression that it's not ultimately sufficient, that the child needs some such, I think Lacan's technical term is suppletion, in the form of, say, like for little Hans, the horse.
Mm-hmm. I see what you mean. Yeah, that's very helpful. So let's just try to work through these real quick with what little time we have left. So I think we've kind of already addressed this business of ego psychology. I think I would invite others, if they have kind of are more well-read in ego psychology. I think as a Lacanian, we have a tendency to sort of be sectarian, and so we reject ego psychologists and we don't read them. But I think in general, we've already addressed this, their aversion to many of the things, many of the themes raised, right? From where and for whom does Freud write? As a medical professional? Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think he's writing from the position of the founder of psychoanalysis and trying to derive some type of scientific legitimacy, although he is very clear at the outset, especially in section 3, as you'll see, that what he is producing is speculative, right? So I think he's really grounding his authority on a philosophical register, right? Even with these references to Nietzsche's eternal return and a number of philosophical references, right? So he's comfortable being speculative, and metapsychology is speculative, as we've seen earlier. How does he conceive of them? Freud writes of incommensurable drives. How does he conceive of them pre-death drive? Is Eros an example? I think we've kind of touched on that as well. And in some sense, we haven't really talked about this notion of instincts and the way in which once death drive is discovered, something which kind of exceeds a biological logic alone. You know, I think the whole theory of drives, anything he said on it before, is kind of scrapped. From where does Freud garner his notion that the child's wish is to be like adults on page 59? Who could answer that?
I think it's right out of Aristotle, actually. I think it's a combination of his theory of like wish and also Aristotle's theory of like telos, when he relates it to organic material, such as animals, which like basically they have, you know, the formal and final drives not drives, sorry, causes. The final cause of a baby zebra is to become an adult zebra. And I think that's how I read this, is like the baby child has somewhere within it actually some sort of, and maybe it's kind of weirdly naturalistic. But I think obviously it gets changed by, you know, signifiers in Lacan, but there's probably, I think that's why that would be how I read Freud reading it. That there's some, I don't know.
Primary identification may also play a role, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after all, what's that, like, posthumous, in Freud's posthumous notes, it's like the first thing the child thinks is, I am the breast.
Yeah, I guess what my question would be, what would be the alternative? Like, it's obvious that the very notion of ego ideal is still operative here, and so I think, you know, the idea of primary caretakers functioning as ego ideals is also very central. So therefore, adulthood is a kind of necessary transition or initiation and so on. Okay, so this might be a big question. But what is given or a priori in Lacan's ontology? Is it that castration is constitutive of primal lack, void of being to the endless chain of signifiers, the central trauma or wound of humanity? Want to know where the ground is before I start even walking with Freud? We'll read the introduction. I see. As you know, or may know, that Jacques-Alain Miller asked Lacan if he has an ontology, and he was kind of waffled on this point. It's a major question. I think many post-Lacanians have gone further than Lacan went in this regard. But I think we've given some hints of it with this notion of Kleinemann, of this kind of this notion of the origin point as this type of kind of beyond biology, like this kind of strange, I don't know, like almost materialist, like even, I would even say like the den in Greek materialism, the DEN, that concept, which if you read Zizek's Less Than Nothing, where he probably develops Lacan's ontology the farthest, even though most Lacanians don't particularly like Zizek, I think he does the best job in this regard. He really grounds it through that kind of like Greek materialist lens. Okay, what is meant by the phrase "the signifier is the mark of the subject"? I think we kind of got into this a moment ago with the relationship between S1 and S2, that the splitting of the subject leaves a trace through primal repression, right? And that is that mark that hangs with it, even as it enters into a relationship of metonymy with other signifiers. Temporary toleration of unpleasure as a step on a long indirect road to pleasure. What happens if reality imposes with such convincing harshness that we can no longer believe that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, and we come to see that our mother will never return? That's a very nice comment. Would Lacan support the Martin Luther King thesis of the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice?
No, nothing in the microcosm or macrocosm prepares us for happiness. He's very fond of quoting this line from Civilization, its discontents, and yeah, making my way through Seminar 7 now. So yeah.
Well, yes, there is a, well, this is actually a much bigger question we need to return to, because it has to do with the unique logic of teleology in Lacan. And to what can we say of teleology in Lacan? It's a very big question. It's actually not as, I don't think we can dismiss it so easily. What is the distinction Freud is drawing between the effects of the phases of ego development and those of the reality principle on the operation of the pleasure principle? Okay, so listen, we've actually reached time by some, and I think these questions I will post on our Dropbox, and I would like for folks to keep them coming. And I would even say, if people wish to make notes, in addition, like we've had 3 or 4 people send notes. As I mentioned, Aaron wrote kind of an essay. I'll post all of that. And maybe even if folks wanted to, would it be cool to create a Google Doc where a question is posted, whether you name yourself or it can be anonymous, and then people can kind of write their thoughts or answers? Because we have a large group, I thought that might be a good thing to do. My only caution here would be, I've done that before, and sometimes people lose stamina with it. So I kind of want to find a way where we don't lose stamina with it. But maybe like a thumbs up on that idea, or a thumbs down. Do you like that idea of that? Take the questions on the Google Doc, because we have so many people on this meeting that are like very knowledgeable and so on and so forth. What do you think? Good? Oh, you put an emoji on. Very cool. Very cool. I don't even know how to do that. Nice. Okay. All right. All right. It's a fiat. Because there's some beautiful points here that are raised, and I don't want to kind of go laboriously through each of them. I'd rather kind of continue this way we've been doing things. And yeah, are there any other kind of things that we've missed or points to raise, and we've only just covered sections 1 and 2. Let me just say one thing. I put an excerpt from a book by Samuel Weber, who's a Derridian, called The Legend of Freud. It's on Dropbox. And I think you should read it. I really thought it's good. He summarizes really well Deleuze and Derrida on Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And I've also put a wonderful excerpt, well, a full essay actually, of Catherine Malibu, and her reading of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And I really gained a lot from it. I'm going to reference it next time we speak. So Malibu and Weber. And then if there are other readings you want to throw on there, secondary readings, and I'll bring some stuff from Lacan as well for next time we meet. But yeah. Voila. I guess we are good. It was a good first session. Thank you all very much. Let me stop sharing. Say hello. Oh, hello, Ben. How are you? You were with us? Hello, everyone. Okay, well, maybe we can do intros next time, since you all are so cool and interesting people. Some of you talked and we don't know who you are, but you're like, oh my God, that was a profound point. Thank you so much. Who are you? That kind of thing, But at the same time, I don't want to do too much. So what do you think? Good? Like, is this a good format, or should we, other thoughts? Email me, email the general email, and we can mix it up if need be.
It's a good format.
Who was that? Aaron. Thank you for your interventions, Aaron, and thank you for your essay.
Thank you.
Will that be on the drop? Will Aaron's essay be on Dropbox? I would love to read it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, presentations be on Dropbox? Sorry about that. Just the last question.
Oh yeah, we're recording this. You mean this recording? Yeah.
I just meant your PowerPoint.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we have this friend, Gabriel Tupanambas, who's, I think, probably one of the best young Lacanians in the world today. He's also happens to be very good at website design, so he can create these fancy websites, and for our group on Coaching Karatani, he is something else.
Also amazing at drawing. His drawing.
Very good at drawing. Very good at drawing. Yeah.
Not that you were bad, but his drawings was.
No. I was bad, and his were very good, which I'm fine with. Okay, very good. Well, I don't want to leave. I want to stay. We can have a drink now. We can have a beer or something like that. Although, what time is it for you, Ben?
I mean, it's nearly midday, so that almost works.
Oh, you're not in Berlin anymore. You're not in Berlin.
No, I mean, I'm in Melbourne.
Okay. Are you teaching right now?
No, not this semester. Next year. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, wonderful. I think we've covered everything I wanted to cover. If there's anything else, we can take it to. I'll do a Google Doc so we can kind of. Do you like those? What is that thing we tried once? Where it's sort of. They have different variations of them, but they're kind of like these group where you do file sharing, you do chat.
Slack.
Slack. Good or bad? I'm kind of. You like Slack, Lauren?
Yeah, I haven't really tried it. It's sort of interesting.
Okay. I'm down. I mean, it's up to you all. Would that be easier? You can do a lot more with it. I mean, in terms of, posing a question and then answering it, it's actually much better than a Google Doc. So maybe I should create a Slack since we have a large group. Should I do that?
I'm interested to try.
Okay. Okay, cool. Where are you based, Annie?
Melbourne.
So many Aussies. My God. Brazil, Australia, and America. We have this weird affinity because of our founding of our countries. There's this weird homologous relation, and so It's very odd that we're all drawn to Lacan too. There has to be some bigger, there's something there, you know? I wonder what it is. I'm not sure. And you had the fires. Now we have these fucking fires. Your fires are done though, yeah?
I'll start again. So, yeah.
Will they?
Yeah.
God help us. Yeah. Why should I stop recording?